we'll have some summing up comments from Nur at the end as well. So the format remains the same, but 20 minutes to speak and 10 minutes for conversation after that. And so I think without any further delay, let me just quickly introduce our next speaker. So our next speaker is Oludamini Ogunnaike, who is a professor of religious studies at Virginia, and he specializes on religious traditions of West and North Africa, particularly Sufism and Ifa. And he's also, of course, involved in, he's very much interested in decoloniality, in Africana philosophy, and in ethics. So without any further delay, let me give him the floor. So please, over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Sajjad. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yeah, yeah, it's good.
Excellent. Thank you so much for inviting me to this conference. It's very rare that a number of my interests coincide like this, so I'm very happy to be at this happy intersection of this. I'm also very happy to have Professor Chase with us. I picked up a copy of Philosophy as a Way of Life when I was first year undergraduate student. My roommate actually had it for another class, and I was reading it, and it was around, I was like, oh, finally, somebody, thank you. So thank you very much for translating it into English and making it available. That was really a seminal moment in my intellectual and academic career. So I want to begin by acknowledging that, and also Sajjad for your article as well, connecting it to Islamic philosophy. So I'm going to try to share my screen now to begin my presentation. All right. Okay. All right, so I'm going to be riffing a bit on Hadot's notion of conversion to speak of decolonization as a form of conversion in the kind of antique sense that Hadot described. And this came about because in preparation for this conference, I was like, okay, how do I think about this? So I said, let me go to Google and just Google Hadot and colonization and see what comes up, if anything comes up. The only reference I could find of colonization in Hadot's work was a short encyclopedia entry on conversion. And he mentions colonization here just in passing in terms of missionary attempts, Christian missionary attempts to colonize people, to convert people in the context of colonization and decolonization. But the more I read this article, the more I kept seeing parallels between Hadot's description of conversion, particularly in its antique senses, a bit in the early Christian senses as well too, and the way in which decolonization is spoken about. So you can see this in this famous quote by Fanon from Damné de la Terre, Wretched of the Earth. Decolonization is always a violent phenomenon. Decolonization is quite simply the replacing of a certain species of men by another species of men. And Hadot in this article says, and all education is conversion. In antiquity, philosophy was essentially conversion, which is to say a return to the self, to one's true essence, through a violent tearing of oneself away from the alienation of unconsciousness. And it's on these themes of conversion, violent restructuring, and education that this talk will kind of circle around. So we'll begin, first of all, by talking about decolonization. It's good to kind of define our terms and be clear what we're speaking about. Then I'll speak a little bit about what's known, particularly in African decolonial studies, but also beyond that, as well as the coloniality of knowledge. Look at some of the advantages of Hadot's method for studying African traditions, and then conclude. All right, so what does it mean to decolonize? So decolonization, despite its radical history in the decolonial movements, really as early as colonization itself, as once people began to colonize and occupy territory on the African continent and North America and elsewhere, there have been movements, even if they didn't use the term decolonial or decolonization, that were decolonial. The term really came into vogue or popularity, see it in the 50s and the 40s, 50s, and 60s in these decolonial movements on the African continent, Asian continent, and elsewhere, striving for independence. But despite its radical history, it's kind of become a synonym for institutional diversity and inclusion initiatives, or anything relating to social justice. So for example, they have decolonizing Lockheed Martin and other weapons companies. There's decolonizing the CIA thing. So it takes on a wide range of meanings, everything from increasing diversity in human resources in the CIA to overthrowing regimes. And this kind of co-option of the term is part of what Eve Tuck and Yang in their article, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, called Moves to Innocence. Right? So it's a move of people who are benefiting from colonial structures to co-opt decolonization as a move to innocence. And this has gotten to the extent that a colleague of mine, Fuluke Adebisi, who teaches in the UK, has spoken of the need to decolonize decolonization. So going back to one of the early definitions of it, Fanon, that I mentioned before in his Wretched of the Earth, says decolonization is always a violent phenomenon. It's quite simply the replacing of a certain species of man or human beings by another species. Now, what is he? By this, he means that colonialism is always held in place and created and maintained through violence. And so therefore, the changing of that will necessarily be perceived and felt as violent as well. And the species of men, we'll get into this a bit later, is this change the species of the citizen and the subject, the colonial species of which are created by the colonial power structure. Tuck and Yang in their famous article describes decolonization as simply to undo colonialism, territorially, institutionally, that is to make a new world / recover an old world at the same time. And this bears significant resonances with Hadot's discussion of conversion as in two Greek terms, epistrophe, which is to go back to the origin or true source, and metanoia, to kind of a new birth as well. I forgot to mention it. So why is decolonization not the same thing as diversity as inclusion? Du Bois famously criticized so-called Western civilization or white civilization, saying that no civilization ever took himself and his own perfectness with such disconcerting seriousness as the modern white man. We who shame and deep insult his aggrandizement so often revolve were never deceived. We looked at him clearly with world-old eyes and saw simply a human thing, weak and pitiable and cruel, even as we are and were. James Baldwin also commented, when white people talk about progress in relationship to Black people, all they can mean and all they can possibly mean by the word progress is how quickly and how thoroughly I can become white. I don't want to become white, I want to grow up, and so should you. Dr. Martin Luther King also said towards the end of his life, so after all these struggles, I've come to believe that we're integrating into a burning house. That is, there's a fine line between diversity and inclusion and assimilation, and a fine line between assimilation and erasure. So into what institutions are we diversifying? In what ways are we including people for what purposes? All right. So, okay, moving on to coloniality of knowledge. As Fanon said, Europe is literally the creation of the third world. That is materially, but also conceptually. So that is the idea of Europe, as Hegel put it, the land of the elevation of the particular to the universal, requires other lands of particulars, requires a constitutive other. So just as Europe is the creation of the third world materially, as all of the gold and diamonds and raw materials that went into producing the Europe that we think of and know now came from the third world, so also intellectually, the modern European self-identity was largely created in contrast to, defined against a barbarian, uncivilized, a colonial subject other. And you can see this particularly this was achieved through processes of knowledge, of education, of intellectual institutions. You can see this in what's called the coloniality of knowledge, which refers to what, again, Fanon called the Manichaean divide between the zone of being and the zone of non-being, between the governors, that is the citizens, and the governed, or subjects, colonial subjects, between those who do the thinking and those who are thought about, between human and subhuman, and ultimately between alive and dead. Knowledge and education naturalize and make these structures seem acceptable and even inevitable. Another way it's been described by some theorists is the coloniality of knowledge for the colonial subjects is to live in others' myths and categories, to be trained and lived and educated in their myths and categories. As Fanon once again said, we're going to him a lot, colonialism is not merely satisfied with holding a people in its grip and emptying the native's brain of all form and content. By a kind of perverse logic, it turns to the past of the oppressed people and distorts it, disfigures, and destroys it. We've heard some examples of this already before. So colonial violence and structures always rebound as fascism. They're called fascism in Europe. They're often called corruption in the third world. And we can see this in examples of epistemicide, the complete erasure, wiping away of epistemic systems. So Césaire pointed this out, Arendt pointed it out, the same colonial violence that had been meted out against Africans, indigenous people in the Americas for centuries finally rebounded against the Europeans in World War II. And so this colonial violence and the structures of control and domination are usually first tried out on the subjects, but then finally the chickens come home to roost. And we can also see this dynamic of the coloniality of knowledge in this construction of the West and the rest. Oh, sorry. The construction of the West and the rest, in which resources and people and data go from the rest to the putative West, and institutions, force, theories, and methods come from the West and are applied to the rest. Now, in the current condition, which some people characterize as liquid coloniality, because it's no longer geographically based, it's no longer strictly based on where you are in the world, just as colonial structures rebound back into the so-called West, colonial institutions and neo-colonial institutions remain. So you have the same dynamic amongst elites and non-elites, Europhones, non-Europhones, etc., in colonized, formerly colonized countries. Okay, now to education, as to how much of this got put in place. So in a wonderful novel by Sheikh Hamidou Khan, a semi-autobiographical novel called Ambiguous Adventure, he writes, on the Black continent it began to be understood that their true power lay not in the canons of the first morning, but rather in what followed the canons. The new school shares at the same time the characteristics of the canon and the magnet. From the canon, it draws its efficacy as an arm of combat, but better than the canon, it makes the conquest permanent. The canon compels the body, the school bewitches the soul. Where the canon has made a pit of ashes and death, in the sticky mold of which men would not have rebounded from the ruins, the new school establishes the morning of rebirth will be a morning of benediction through the appeasing virtue of the new school. Similarly, Kenyan author Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the author of Decolonizing the Mind, wrote, the night of the sword and the bullet was followed by the morning of the chalk and the blackboard. The physical violence of the battlefield was followed by the psychological violence of the classroom. And I love reading colonial sources because they're very explicit. They're not concerned about political correctness. So Georges Hardy, who was in charge of education in French West Africa, wrote in his book In Conquête Morale, in order to transform the primitive people of our colonies, in order to make them more devoted to our cause and useful to our enterprise, we have a limited number of means at our disposal. The safest means is to take the native from childhood, to make him assiduously frequent us and be subjected to our moral and intellectual customs. In one word, to open schools, in which his mind can be formed according to our intentions. This is the reason, for example, my father, like many colonial subjects in West Africa, went to a boarding school. They were trying to isolate him from native influences. Waziri Junaidu, who's a famous Islamic scholar in northern Nigeria, said at the 1971 commencement speech of Ahmadu Bello University, which is the largest university in the north of Nigeria, your university, like all others in Nigeria, is a cultural transplant whose roots lie in another tradition. It's little wonder that our so-called modern elite find it so easy to violate the very laws and principles which they themselves create. When your own world is put aside, you feel no respect for any other. These are just some quotes and perspectives from the various African traditions, particularly West Africa. Amadou Hampate Ba kind of lays out the situation clearly and the kind of neo-colonial dynamic of this. Hampate Ba is a Malian belles lettres and scholar and Tijani Sufi, most famous for his saying, in Africa, when an old man dies, it's a library that burns. He wrote that the Western school began fighting the African school, that is the various traditions of learning, whether indigenous or Islamic, in African societies, and chasing away the possessors of traditional knowledge It was a time when every healer was jailed as a charlatan or for illegal practice of medicine. So many of the teachers and specialists in these traditions were jailed in colonial rule. During the colonial period, the initiatic transmission, which had been done in the past in a regular way, had to take refuge in a kind of secrecy in the bush outside of urban areas. Little by little, the growing distance between the young and their families meant that the elders could no longer find young people around them to receive their teachings. But the final blow was struck by the advent of independence based on European ideas and ideologies. Whereas colonialism drew skepticism and barely penetrated into the bush, these same European ideas conveyed by modern political parties mobilized the masses even in the furthest corners of the bush, so that transmission could barely find any space in which to operate. That is, a generation of people who would have been the next scholars, who would have been the next babalao, priests, etc., were sent to, through pushes for universal education, were sent to school. And thousands of intellectual traditions across the continent effectively ended, not during colonialism, but at independence and pushes for universal education. So he writes, at a time when all these countries of the world through UNESCO are trying to save these monuments, is it not more urgent to save the prodigious capital of knowledge and human culture accumulated during the millennia in these fragile monuments that are men and women and whose last depositories are disappearing? Yeah, so it says, nowadays, when an old wise man or woman disappears, all his or her knowledge and learning disappear with him into the night, and I want this neither for Africa nor for humanity. All right, so what does this mean for intellectual decolonization? Since Africans and their intellectual traditions were often the constitutive other against which the modern colonial system defined itself, and often upon whose backs it was built, these African traditions, I believe, are uniquely important for decolonization efforts. Now, what would they look like? Go back to Hadot again on the phenomenon of conversion. He says, at all levels, the phenomenon of conversion reflects the irreducible ambiguity of human reality. On the one hand, it testifies to the liberty of the human being, capable of totally transforming herself and reinterpreting her past and her future. But on the other hand, it reveals that this transmission of human reality results from an invasion of forces exterior to the me, that is more about divine grace or some psychosocial constraint. Platonic philosophy is at its heart a theory of political conversion. In order to change the city, it's necessary to transform men, but only the philosopher is really capable of this because he himself is converted. So I suggest that intellectual decolonization, in a certain sense, requires a similar kind of conversion from within and from without, and that it requires the significant, it's not enough to just convert oneself. The project is both internal and external. And so what would that look like? Instead of having one academy or one tradition, having multiple academies or multiple traditions, or at least acknowledging the existence of, or stop trying to destroy other academies and traditions. In another article I have, I compare this to moving from monolingualism to multilingualism, kind of conceptually. So moving from just speaking one conceptual language to being fluent in multiple conceptual languages and traditions, to think from multiple perspectives, not just from one perspective or set of categories. This would mean an explosion of the West and the rest binary that still structures so many things from life expectancy to income to citation to all of these different things. That is trying to reconstitute or create an intellectual pluriverse, which would mean, as I said, the kind of exploding of the myth of the West as this entity from Plato to NATO and its universality. When we say philosophy, oftentimes we mean Western philosophy. When we say education, we mean Western education. Even clothing, when you say clothing, everybody assumes it's Western. You go to the UN, the only people wearing not in suits and ties are the Khalijis and the Nigerians. It's an absurd state of affairs. So this, I think, requires a form of conversion, a form of philosophical conversion, which is to say a mode of education for recovering humanity, a form of humanity beyond the colonizer, colonized, civilized, savage, developing binaries that structure so much of our geopolitics, our thinking, our linguistic practices. Interestingly, you see senses of this are already developed in indigenous African traditions and in West African Sufi and even Salafi traditions that portray modern Western education as a kind of counter-initiation. So in my research amongst Babalawo, priests of Ifa in Nigeria and Sufis in West Africa, they weren't necessarily entirely opposed. Some of them were entirely opposed to sending their kids to school, but even those who sent their kids to school say, yeah, we have to do, the ones we send to school, we have to do extra initiatic things to them because they're getting a counter initiation. They're getting another form of initiation, and there are certain ritual practices we need to do to counter that so we don't lose them. And I think this is a kind of model for what I think, what Hadot can tell us about decolonial work. So Hadot also says, only, this is one of his more famous quotes, it's often quoted out of context, only he who is capable of a genuine encounter with the other is capable of an authentic encounter with himself. And the converse is equally true. From this perspective, every spiritual exercise is a dialogue, insofar as it is an exercise of authentic presence to oneself and others. So the question I have for this, or the way I think this quote or this perspective of Hadot speaks to decoloniality, is this authentic encounter with oneself. So to truly know oneself, if that requires truly being open, a genuine encounter with the other, how does coloniality affect that? And I think this goal of Hadot's is very much in line with the goals of decoloniality, but it's only truly possible in the deepest sense through a profound conversion that decoloniality requires. So as Aimé Césaire wrote in his discourse on colonialism, he says, I admit it's a good thing to place different civilizations in contact with each other, and it's an excellent thing to blend different worlds. Civilization that withdraws into itself atrophies for civilizations exchanges oxygen. But I ask, has colonization really placed civilizations in contact? Between colonization and civilization, there's an infinite distance. That is, in order to truly open oneself, in order for there to actually be a dialogue and exchange, these structures of power, of being, need to be changed. Otherwise, no real dialogue is possible. And according to Hadot, no real knowledge of oneself is possible. So moving now to a slightly different tack, but related, Hadot's contributions to the study of African philosophy and religion. So I think Hadot's methods are very felicitous for examining African so-called indigenous and Islamic traditions for a number of reasons. That is going back to at least the 18th century. There have been noted similarities between African indigenous traditions and then later Islamic traditions and antique and late antique traditions. So in Olaudah Equiano's slave narrative and other early slave narratives refrain of comparing African indigenous traditions and religions to ancient Greek traditions in terms of animal sacrifice, polytheism, or so-called polytheism, and many other mystery cults, etc. So, and this trend has continued well down to the present day amongst African philosophers, particularly in Francophone Africa, where they study ancient philosophy more. I can't tell you how many students I've met, philosophy students who are like, oh yeah, this ancient stuff, Iamblichus, makes sense to me. It's like what my grandmother does. Things of sacrifice, theurgy, notions of the daimon, all have very close equivalents or analogs, I should say, in a number of indigenous African traditions. And then with Islamic traditions as well. Hadot's method is useful, therefore, because of the similarities, it has some applicability to African traditions as well. Hadot's method is also useful in the way it historicizes, particularizes, and provincializes modern philosophy, and often the theories drawn from it, and its kind of pretensions to universality. So usually Kant is used is used in a kind of universal way, or even Foucault, to interpret anything at any time in any place. But the same is not true of African thinkers or tradition. They're localized and particularized. So by Hadot, by historicizing and particularizing and criticizing that, kind of opens up some space there. In doing so, Hadot's method also undoes the narrowing of philosophy and some of the racialized Enlightenment logics. You can see Park's 2013 work on this, and valorizes and makes the philosophical significance of various African traditions potentially more legible to a Western educated audience. That is, these traditions are generally more interested in producing wise people instead of theoretical models. And when they're read in this way, the rituals, the orature, the text and their philosophical significance can be better appreciated. Hadot also takes his texts, his traditions, not as mere objects of study, but as traditions to be learned from and thought with, not just about. I think this is very felicitous and should be applied, and some people are now applying it to African traditions as well. His emphasis on spiritual exercises, that is, on how text and orature are used, not just what they say, is critically important for both African, indigenous, and Islamic traditions. It's not enough just to translate a prayer or a text. You really have to look at how it's used to get what's going on there, particularly in the West African context for reasons I can talk about later. Hadot also attends to and takes traditions seriously on their own terms. And the point of his scholarship of loving old truths, of making them live within us. That is, scholarship as a therapeutic search for truth, as a cultivation of wisdom, better self, and a better world, is shared by many African, Islamic, and indigenous traditions. And I think it's something that we as scholars can learn to. Why are we doing what we're doing? It's not because it pays us a lot of money. So in conclusion, I think Hadot invites us, or his work invites us to see decolonization as a form of conversion. That is something that's both a radical return as well as a new birth, a freeing of the human from the genocidal and epistemicidal forces that continue to structure us and our societies. Now, by this, I don't mean a return to a kind of lost authenticity that you see in some of these reactionary movements that ends up actually replicating and reinforcing the same colonial logics, but a kind of new birth of something new. Integrating the old. Our academic institutions are bound up in these colonial logics and structures, financially, epistemologically, and many other ways. And so decoloniality is not merely diversifying the faculty, the curricula, or even the methods of these institutions. It has to go beyond that. Amongst some of the things that are important to consider in this are, when we speak about our audience, who are we writing for? And when we say us and our, who's the us and who's the our? In our academic discussions. For whom are we writing? Why are we writing? Why are we doing our scholarship? I think Hadot's corpus, as well as the West African traditions I study, also invite us to think about this much more. Hadot's work encourages us to think with and from African traditions, not just about them. And also to complicate the critical, confessional, or scientific, theological, or ritual intellectual divides. And also examine the colonial history of their construction. That is, as these various territories were conquered, all of the intellectual, so-called non-Western intellectual traditions were considered religious and theological and not critical. And the only critical ones are the post-Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment ones. Everything else is not critical. So these categories have very particular and colonial history in their construction. And I think Hadot's method and any serious examination of these African traditions invites us to rethink them, if not jettison them completely. Also, the traditions I study, they're living traditions. So I work with text, but I also interview people. And this is the case for various reasons for a number of African, indigenous, and Islamic traditions. And that is, in our work, I think we should take advantage of non-Europhone intellectual sages, whatever they're called. And this can be very informative in working through the texts, the ideas, the concepts that we're thinking about. This can often involve getting a kind of double training in those institutions and traditions, as well as those in our graduate school. To echo Corbin said we need to get Islamic philosophy and Sufism out of the ghetto of Orientalism. I think Hadot's method also invites us to do the same thing. Note the racialized and colonial logic there, the term there. I think he's arguing this not for the validation of dominant academia. It's not like we need somebody to tell us Mullah Sadra is great or Ibn Arabi is smart, has something to say to us, but rather to unleash the transformative potential of these traditions for ourselves, society, and our world. And even though, when you think about it, the process of decolonization seems impossible if you seriously think about it and think about the scale and the scope. But we have some interesting examples from 18th to 20th century West African Sufi reform movements. Some of them which were explicitly decolonial, almost all of them began as teaching spiritual movements. Also, many of the revolts of enslaved Africans in the Americas, such as the Haitian Revolution, which began with the Vodun ceremony of Boakeman, also began as spiritual movements as well too. So conditions are tough for us in many ways, but they were also tough for the people in those conditions, and they were able to do something about it. And so can we, and so must we, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's take at least one question to begin with, and then see how it goes. There's not much time, but yeah, at least one question. Anyone wish to ask it? Norman, you want to ask the question?
Michael and Prashant both had their hands up before me.
I can't see it.
No, mine was a mistake, but I love the talk. Thank you, though.
Yeah, what a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much for that. But, you know, the question it leaves me with is this project, I mean, this kind of goes back to one of the points that Paul made in his presentation about the institution. You know, what are we, this process that I mean, at best we can only, we only perform a kind of paracletic function. Yeah, like announcing something that is to come, but nothing more than that.
I mean, perhaps that's one way. I don't have it all figured out, and I'm not necessarily prescriptive about this is what you need to do. This is the decolonization program. Come take Bayal with me. We're going to go. You know, I'm not at that stage. But I think it's one of the perversions of the colonial logic is to accept its inevitability. I like to say coloniality is hegemonic or modernity is hegemonic, but it's not omnipotent. It's not omnipotent. So it's good to be critical, and it's necessary to be critical of all of these ways in which decolonization is simply co-opted to make a better machine, as a kind of pressure relief valve, as like, you know, yard time in the prison. Right? The point isn't to make a better prison; it's to get out of prison. And so when I think about decolonization, I'm thinking of a much more radical transformation of the institutions, if not abandonment of them. You know, I don't have everything all figured out, but there are some interesting historical precedents of not only, so we have the Sufi movements as well, but even within the political decolonial movements in South Africa, in Algeria, and other places as well too, people were setting up schools outside of the colonial schools. They were training people. They were trying to build a new society on the foundation of a different form of education. And in many ways, those projects failed. In some ways, they succeeded. But I think we can learn from those successes and those failures of people like Amilcar Cabral in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. Some of the efforts of people in Zimbabwe, Zambia, Tanzania, Ethiopia, as well too, in which they tried to develop alternative education systems, build new society, new kinds of models, and ultimately a new world resulting in political power. But I think this is partly where Hadot is useful. But I don't want to reduce it to a liberal notion of kind of, I'm personally anti-racist, therefore it's all good. You know, I don't think that's ridiculous. But I do think the conversion does have to happen. It's not just interior, but the interior dimension can't be left out. There has to be a radical transformation in the way one sees the world, in the way one is in the world, in the way one reacts, in the way one speaks, etc. In order, and then that can spread. And then, how did colonialism start? Colonialism was made by people. The colonial order was constructed and created by people through certain changes and shifts, and those intellectual and other shifts, and economic shifts and technological shifts, and so on and so forth. And then it happened. it was made by people that you can make something else. People can make something else, if it's God's will. So that's what I think. I don't think we can just throw up our hands and be like, oh, that's it. I mean, there are enslaved Muslims in Brazil led revolts. What chance did they have? They're literally enslaved. But they tried. They would teach Quran, they would teach fiqh, they would teach tasawwuf. And when they encroached on their teaching, those passing on of those traditions, they revolted. So if they can do it, me sitting in my house with air conditioning, I can try to.
I think that's a really important point that, we do need to think about decoloniality as much more than just intellectual exercise of language. It's not just a problem of language which needs to be repaired, but it's actually ourselves and our wider context which requires that reparation. And I think, I've used the word reparation before. We need to actually use the language of reparation a lot more than perhaps sometimes we do. And I thank Norman and Noor for kind of alerting me to that. I think we should move on, and because I hope there'll be time at the end with those summing up to come back to a lot of these questions. We've had some wonderful question and conversations so far. So let's move to